Welcome to the information session on registering and forfeiting PRCs. Please note that this session does not cover the surrender of PRCs for the purpose of meeting scheme liabilities. In this session, we'll be looking at concepts such as the base vintage year, multiple vintage years, activities which give rise to those vintage years, apportioning PRCs across vintages, registering PRCs in TESA, and then how to forfeit PRCs in TESA. Unlike the energy savings scheme, which pulls forward future year savings and then credits them in a single year, we refer to this as forward creation and single vintage, the PRCs credits future benefits across those future years. This results in the assignment of certificates from a single implementation across multiple years, and we refer to this as multiple vintages. Unlike the ESS, which uses calendar years as the reference point for those vintages, the PRCs vintage runs from the 1st of April to the 31st of March in the following calendar year, and we name the vintage after the second of those 2 calendar years. Let's have a look at an example. In this example, an implementation happens in November 2023. This will have a base vintage of 2024 because it occurs after the 1st of April in 2023 and before the 31st of March 2024. Despite occurring in the calendar year of 2023, it takes on the vintage of 2024. The number of vintages or vintage years corresponds to the lifetime of the activity. TESA uses the base vintage to apportion PRCs across each subsequent vintage for the lifetime of the activity. We can find the lifetime in the activity definition part of the PRCs rule. And here's an example. It's activity definition RF2, replacing a refrigerator display cabinet with a new high efficiency cabinet. And if we were to scroll down to the bottom of that activity definition, at the lower section, that's where we would find the lifetime. And in this particular activity, there's more than one lifetime, so we must select the correct class that corresponds to the refrigerator cabinet that we've installed. And in this case, that happens to be 8 years. TESA apportions PRCs across each vintage in the lifetime of the activity, commencing with the base vintage year. It's important to remember that if you miss out on registering your PRCs by the deadline for that base vintage year, you may still register PRCs for the remaining vintages. When forfeiting PRCs, ACPs must apportion their forfeits across all of the vintages for which they've improperly created the PRCs, not just the base vintage or some other single vintage. TESA shows ACPs the PRCs that they have set aside under their deeds and undertakings, and it'll also show PRCs that are not set aside, which are also available to forfeit. And these can be combined if the quantities set aside are not sufficient. TESA will tally these up and show you the total. It's important to remember that TESA only allows registrations for one base vintage at a time. If you attempt to do more than that, you'll receive an error message. Auditors must produce PRC assurance tables for each vintage separated by the base vintage. Look at an example, the installation of refrigerator display cabinets, activity definition RF2. One RDC installed on the 23rd of June 2024 would have a base vintage of 2025. The PRCs from this activity would be 30. And they're spread out over a lifetime of 8 years. Let's have a look at how TESA apportions those PRCs.
So the first step is to allocate your PRCs evenly across the vintages. So remembering in this case, we've got 8 years to apportion. And so this is what it starts to look like. You'll notice that we're able to allocate 3 to each of those vintage years, and then we've got some left over. And so now we need to apportion them to the first of those years, so 2025, 2026, 2027, until they're exhausted. And that looks a bit like this. And you'll notice in those last 2 years, there aren't any remaining PRCs to be distributed. So that's an example just using one implementation, but you can also allocate PRCs for what we call batches of implementations. So in this case, imagine we previously just showed 30, but imagine now doing 50 RDCs, producing 1,500 PRCs. That can be done in much the same way. And here you can see that it's landing with the distribution is still done so that more are going into the initial years and fewer in the final years.
So in summary, if your implementation is between 1 April and 31 December, then your base vintage is the next calendar year. If the implementation is from 1 January to 31 March, then the base vintage takes on the same year as the calendar year. You should allocate your PRCs evenly across vintages, starting with the base vintage. If you have any leftovers, the earlier vintages get 1 extra PRC each, and Tessa will do this for you. When registering or auditing PRCs, separate those PRCs into batches based on the base vintage. Now let's have a look at an example for how to register in Tessa. Here we're using the activity definition WH1, replacing a hot water heater with a heat pump hot water system. If we scroll down to the bottom of the WH1 activity, we get a lifetime of 12 years. And I'll now hand over to Alfredo, who'll show you how to do those registrations in Tessa using this example.
Thank you, Paul, and good morning all. We're not going to go through every single step of the registration process. I'm assuming most of you have already registered SKIs or PRCs in the past, but if you haven't and you want to see how the full process works from when you log into Tessa through payment and the end result of having your certificates in your account, you can check our videos on the knowledge article section of Tessa. Here I'm going to highlight some of the concepts that Paul just explained. And in this scenario, in this example, we have a set of implementations that possibly were audited and included in the same scope, but these implementations were related to 2 different base vintages or 2 different bandwidths. As you can see here, we have a list of 7 implementations, and as Paul explained, we have to relate these implementations to 1 base vintage. Tessa can only process implementations related to 1 base vintage at a time. So if you had a situation where the audit or you have a batch of implementations spread across 2 base vintages, the first thing you have to do is to split them. And in this situation, you would have to do 2 uploads to register your certificates. So here in Tessa, I'm intending to register the implementations related to the 2023 base vintage. As such, I have to remove those implementations that you can see they're highlighted in yellow, because those ones belong to the 2024 base vintage. Once I finish this registration, then I have to come back to TESA and initiate a new registration case to register those ones highlighted against the 2024 base vintage. You can see here in TESA as well, in this registration form on the bottom of the slide, after you select your PDRS base vintage, that field called PDRS vintage is what Paul described as base vintage. You can see the time frame that we're going to be covering. So your implementations have to fall under that time frame. In this case, from 1st of April 2022 to the 31st of March 2023. So we have removed any implementations that don't belong to this base vintage, and then we have uploaded those. Skipping a few steps, such as validations and payments, we get the end result here, which are your PRC batches. You might have seen in the previous slide, there was a little red text that indicated that we have missed the deadline to register 2023 base vintage. As Paul explained, you still have the opportunity to register the rest. The WH1 activity definition defines 12 years. As such, you should be expecting 12 vintages. But in this case, because we have missed the deadline, we're not gonna get the first vintage, the 2023, but we still get the rest. So if we count the entries here, the records here, we'll see 11 lines. That means you're still getting your 11 vintages, and the certificates have been distributed or apportioned, as Paul explained in the previous slides. In this example, we ended up with an even distribution of PRCs across these 11 vintages. So TESA behind the scenes is going through that logic that Paul showed us in the animation in the previous slide. These certificates will be in your account, and you can always see them in the My Certificates dashboards. We also have videos for that in the knowledge articles in TESA. So that was the registration scenario. Paul also talked about forfeits. And in this example, let's pretend that the compliance team is requesting for you to conduct a forfeit of 1,488 PRCs against specific vintages. So you would get some instructions to apportion your forfeit in this way, following this table. As you can see, for the 2023 vintage, the forfeit of 35 PRCs, followed by some quantities from 125 to 123 PRCs, as well as 89 towards the last vintage here of 2035. So how do we do this in TESA? From your home page, you go to the forfeit certificates option. And here at the bottom of the slide, you can see we have the forfeit form. The first thing you have to do is to select the right type of certificate, in this case, PRCs. Once you've selected PRCs, the form will show you all the PRCs that you hold in your account. So as Paul mentioned, you can conduct a forfeit out of your PRCs on set-aside hold, or the ones that are not on hold. Preferably, you start with the ones on set-aside, but both tables look the same. In this example, we're showing the set-aside table, and you would have a column that shows you the quantities available for you to forfeit. That means you have those PRCs in your account. And you will be able to start selecting by clicking that pencil icon. You will be able to start selecting each of the vintages and enter your amounts. And once you are done selecting all the amounts against each of those vintages, you'll see the summary in this table on the same page in TESA. As Paul mentioned, if you don't have enough certificates in your set-aside holdings, you can also forfeit out of your non-set-aside holdings. And in the end, at the bottom of the form, you'll see the total certificates to forfeit, which will tally up both set-asides and not set-asides. In this case, I had enough from my set-asides, and we can see the total, confirming that I can fulfill the forfeit request for my part, and the amount there is 1,488 PRCs. TESA will allow you to submit, and this case will come to us for assessment and completion.